Hi, this is Linda with Watery Wishes, and I'm back with a card, and it's using the Simon Says Stamp Beautiful Flowers stamp set, but I'm using a new technique to me. I recently bought some Tombow dual tip brush pens. Now, these pens aren't cheap, but I got them at a pretty good deal from Amazon, and I bought a couple of 10 packs, so my colour choices are very limited, but I did have a few yellows, a couple of greens, a blue and a pinkish red that I could work with, and so I'll be just using what I have to make do color wise. So as you can see, I'm scribbling them onto my Tim Holtz glass craft mat, and at the moment I'm using the lightest yellow that I have, which is a very pale yellow, and I've got my water in a lid up above just so I can keep it contained because I don't want it going everywhere. And I'm using the water, dipping a water brush that doesn't have any water in it in the water that's sitting in the lid, and diluting the scribbled colour that is on the craft mat. Now, I gave them all the flowers a gentle coat of the light yellow, and now I've come in with a darker yellow, and I'm shading where the artist has drawn the lines where the image is going to be darker. Now, if you have no idea of how to colour an image, usually the best guide is if it's an image like this where the artist has drawn in the shadows, or if the image doesn't have lines like this and isn't as detailed, look at the packaging and you'll usually see a really good example of how a stamp has been coloured in. And if that fails, you can always Google the stamp set, and usually you'll find images that the design team for that stamp company has produced cards with the stamp set, and even other people that just put their cards on social media. So I'm just building up the color in layers, and here I'm bringing in a touch of orange to darken up that yellow. And these sort of work a little bit like watercolors, but they're really more like water painting with dye inks. And as you can see, I'm just dabbing that darker color right at the bottom of those lines that the artist has drawn. And I'm just trying to get some contrast between the really light areas of the petals and the much darker areas. Now I go in with a little bit darker again, because I'm trying to build up the contrast so that they don't look so one-dimensional. And the easiest way to do that is to get a bit of contrast going within the image. So now I'm coming in with that mid-tone a little bit more and blending out that dark colour just a little bit into the lighter yellow. So even though I'm sort of doing the same thing over and over again, I've left it all the colouring in this video because I felt that there are some people out there that might find it a bit useful. I'm not saying that my colouring job of these flowers is perfect, but I feel that it is a good example of how to work with a limited colour palette and get a decent amount of contrast. So now I've just got a little bit of that lighter colour just going over the light edges, and now I'm going to darken up the centre bits just a touch more. And now is where you really see where that contrast really makes the images pop. Now that I'm just dabbing that very lightly in the darkest bits of the shading. This is my favorite bit because this is where it all sort of comes together, and you can, once you get that contrast in, you can really see how they're not one-dimensional anymore. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the leaves, and I had like a really light limey yellow green and a bright spring grassy green. So I brought in some blue to darken that green up a little bit, but it sort of made it look a little bit fluoro. So what I'm going to do to fix this, because I don't want them looking different, I've put a bit more water in them, water in the green, and I'm colouring in all the leaves that are the same with the green. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the contrasting colour to green, which is a red. And I'm going to mix that in with the green, and it's going to brown and darken the green up a little bit, and you'll see as I start painting over it, it darkens the colour up just a little bit so that it's not as fluoro. And then I'll actually come in with a little bit darker, where I've just added a little bit more of that pinky red. So while I wait for that to dry, I'm going to colour in the other leaves with the slightly different green that I've got going there. Not that you can really see much of a difference because it just looks almost the same on paper. So here is where you can really see that darker green come in. And it's sort of almost like a greeny brown, and I felt that I had a little bit too much on that flower bud, so I'm just lifting some of that up and putting some brighter green down over it, and then I'll come back and fix that up later if it needs it when it dries. So now I'm working on the background, and I should have waited for certain parts of it to dry before I did this, and I didn't, because I'm not a very patient crafter. So the idea here was to get a bit of a gradient of blue, darker in underneath where the flowers are and lighter as it goes out from the floral arrangement. And there I just sprayed the card with a bit of water. Oh, and I forgot to mention, this is a piece of Canson XL, and I've stamped this on the smoother side. Not that there is a smooth side to Canson XL, but there is a slightly smoother side. So I'm really using the wrong brush here, but not only am I an impatient crafter, I'm a lazy crafter. So I didn't want to have to go out and get a whole thing of water to get a proper brush and do this wash right. And you'll see there a bit of the green is mixed in with the blue over near that bud, so I've got to lift it back up, scrub it a little bit, lift a bit of that colour back up. And I end up getting a paintbrush out, a filbert paintbrush, and going over certain parts of it. But I do get some hard edges in there, so you will see how I don't fix it, but sort of make it part of the end result. So basically I make it look like it was on purpose rather than just sheer laziness and mistakes. So now I'm just darkening up that corner underneath where those flowers are, and I get to the point where I actually start going in with the marker itself to darken up that area a fair bit actually. So I'm putting the marker in there, and then I'm softening it with a little bit of water. And it's up in the right hand corner. I've got a little bit of that hard edge where the paper wasn't wet enough. Now I'm getting a bit of that blue off that was in the yellow of the flowers there. And see, now I'm trying to brush it out, but that's not working. So I get a bit of water and I flick it onto the card, and I get up the bits that are on the flowers because I don't want the colour lifting out of those. And now I'm going to flick some of that blue, the very watered down blue, onto that background piece. And I'm not going to lift it up. I'm actually going to dry it with a heat tool, and that will give me some very splotchy, some with hard edges, sort of like when you get distress ink and you lift up certain parts of it. And here I'm basically taking one of the markers and colouring in some cardstock. I did initially try the darker one and it was a little bit too dark, so I'm going over with the lighter one, and I'm using the Painted Happy Birthday die set from Simon Says Stamp. And I'm just going to run that through my Sizzix Big Shot. Now I actually run a bit of white through as well, because the yellow birthday didn't have enough contrast up against the yellow flower that it was going to overlap on. So I do eventually die cut some white and use that underneath the yellow as an offset so that it just gives a bit of contrast between the letters and the flowers. Now, when I take my word dies out of the dies, when I take the bits of die cuts out, if I have an eye, which is called a tittle, I usually stick that to the washi. I get it out with the washi tape, and then I stick it to my crafting surface so that I don't lose the dot on the eye, because there's nothing worse than getting all the way done with a card and then not being able to find that bloody tittle. It's it's very frustrating. So here I'm sticking some yellow cardstock. I can't remember the name. It's a Simon Says Stamp yellow cardstock that I got out of one of their kits. And I'm just sticking that down to a landscape top folding card base, A2 size card base from Nina 110. Here is where I'm looking at the die cut and realize that the birthday doesn't stand out enough. The Y doesn't stand out next to that, like on top of that flower. So here I am with the white die cut, and I'm going to stick that underneath the yellow, and I'm going to use a trick that a fellow YouTuber, Ashley Tucker, used just a few days ago, and I thought it was great, where she puts the glue on the back of the piece of the die cut, and then she puts it down on a scrap piece of cardstock or paper to get rid of any of the excess glue, so you don't have it oozing out the sides of where you adhere the die cuts. And I just thought that that was a really great tip. You don't have to worry about putting too much glue on the pieces that you're adhering, because you're going to get a lot of that excess off on that spare piece of scrap paper. And see how well that washi tape works to get the pieces out. There's no poking around and fiddling, it just pops them straight out. And I even do this with the tittle for the eye, although that one is a little bit harder and finicky to do, but I do it. See, I've got that tittle and the other one stuck on that other piece of washi on my craft surface, and it was stuck there so I didn't lose it. Really is the best thing I've learnt to do to keep that tittle from getting lost. Okay, now usually I would use score tape to stick down a watercolored panel, but what I'm doing instead is I'm bending the card backwards and forwards and rolling it a little bit the opposite direction. And what this does is it helps to loosen up the fibers within the paper so that it's not as warped when you put it down. And then I use liquid adhesive, and then I get something heavy. I either hold it down with my hands, or I get something flat and heavy like a block, and I put something on top of it to even the pressure out, distribute the pressure over the card. And that will usually straighten out a slightly warped piece of like watercolor paper that you've used onto your card. So there you just saw me use my mono sand eraser to get a little bit of glue off the H. And I'm using that same method where you put the glue on the die cut, put it onto the scrap piece of paper to get the excess off, and then put it onto the card while adhering this to the card. And the reason I think this is a really great tip is because you can use just about any sort of adhesive when you are using this trick. Because you're not going to have any oozing out, you can use glossy accents and it's not going to leave glossy spots on your cards because you're not leaving excess glue coming out. You could use any sort of glue, and it really is a great tip that Ashley showed, and I'm pretty much gonna just stick it in my toolkit of tricks from now on. So here I am stamping a flower from that set, because there are 3 matching flowers that are individual and they're matching to the actual big spray of flowers. And I'm putting the flower on the envelope and on the inside of the card. And I'm using the darker yellow Tombow marker to scribble the colour onto the stamp, and then I'm spritzing it with some water and then stamping it down and then lifting it up. And there, I'm just getting a little mark off my card with that sand eraser. And there we have the card and the matching envelope. So I hope you enjoyed watching this card. It was a very different technique for me. If you did like it, hit the like button. If you disliked it, hit the dislike button. If you did like it, I would love it if you subscribed. I'll see you guys in the next one. And don't forget, have fun, crafting your imagination. Bye.